Hi everybody, finally at long last, my final video in my little free speech project. You may notice there's no video like on camera and I sound kind of funny. That is because I am sick as a frickin' dog and you don't need to hear me snot. Or see me snot. Oh boy, this is going to be rough. Okay, let's get right into it. The First Amendment, as you see right here, reads simply, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The U.S. Constitution was the first document of its kind in history. It was a compromise document, not nigh unto a religious text the way people treat it today. As compromise documents tend to be, it was flawed, and the Founding Fathers knew it. Therefore, they created a process under which the Constitution could be amended. Much like many things in the early years of America, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, also known as the Bill of Rights, originated in fear. Specifically, fear of a presidency eroding into a monarchy, the form of government that early immigrants to America were fleeing. Who knew that some of the Founding Fathers could see into the future all the way to the election of Donald Trump? That was a joke. More on that later. In interpreting documents of this sort, text and context are equally important, and the collection of things included in the First Amendment is telling. The amendments to the Constitution don't override the Constitution. They outline rights that some Founding Fathers believe weren't adequately protected by the main wording of the document. Remember that the Constitution is a product of the Enlightenment, a time when people were just starting to understand the raw power of the mass-distributed written word. Mass dissemination of writing was new. It was exciting. Literacy rates were starting to rise. Human progress was palpable. That was exciting. It was also scary. The Constitution itself was primarily interested in the structure and limits of the new form of government that the Founding Fathers were designing. It was a rejection of the Hobbesian social contract under which government had absolute power over its citizens, believing this kept them separated from humanity's naturally warlike instincts. The Founding Fathers based their ideas on John Locke's belief in inalienable rights and limited representative government. To create a structure for these philosophical ideas, the Founding Fathers, many of whom believed that the King James Bible and the divine right of kings could piss off, reached all the way back to ancient Greece. And now you understand why I picked the historical periods and locations I did for the previous videos in this series. Thomas Paine put it this way in 1792. What Athens was in miniature, America will be in magnitude. The Founding Fathers used Athenian democracy as a template for American democracy, including things like secret ballots, jury duty, and popular referendums, while doing away with practices like the banishment of citizens by popular vote, a process called ostraca, which is the root of the word ostracize. The Founding Fathers were extremely careful to create a document in the Constitution that prevented the worst elements of both Athenian democracy and monarchies. This is extremely important in today's context, since both the extreme left and the extreme right are trying to claw back protections of individual rights. The tactics that modern political extremists are employing are also rooted in monarchy and ancient Athens. Consolidation of power, insisting that the amount of noise a group makes is directly linked to the merits of their opinions, and intimidating dissenters into retreat from public spaces. The Founding Fathers also left out elements of Athenian democracy that gave moneyed interests too much influence over voting patterns, something recent U.S. court decisions seem to have forgotten. Again, more on that in a bit. The Founding Fathers all agreed that representative democracy was an improvement over monarchy, but they disagreed on what was required to protect that new democracy. A group of Founding Fathers, known as the Anti-Federalists, believed that the original wording of the U.S. Constitution gave the president too much power. Furthermore, they believed the main text of the Constitution did not spend enough time outlining specific inalienable rights of citizens. They wanted to limit centralized power and grant more power to the states, while at the same time clearly outlining individual rights upon which these states could not infringe. Yeah, easier said than done. But they had the right idea. Throughout history, the powerful have sought increasing power, often just for power's sake. Without checks on the system and a transparent process, corruption and oppression will leach into any system. Hobbes wasn't wrong about humanity's capacity for strife. He just incorrectly diagnosed the cause of that strife. It's much easier to go to war under systems where leaders have absolute power than under a system that gives their people a say. Anyone who's played a civilization game knows that. But the founding fathers were also wary of the populist mob. As James Madison put it, in all very numerous assemblies of whatever characters composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Are you listening, Twitter? James Madison was the primary drafter of the structure of the Constitution, but he was also an anti-federalist. Other prominent anti-federalists included Samuel Adams and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Despite this, the Anti-Federalists were less well organized than the Federalists, and their popular bases of support were among farmers in rural areas, not the more well-connected residents of America's early cities. These Anti-Federalists began a practice central to American politics: protection of minority rights. They held up signing the Constitution until a Bill of Rights was drafted. And of these first 10 amendments to the Constitution, 9 focused on individual freedoms. Only 1 focused on states' powers. These amendments group together rights and freedoms the Founding Fathers saw as linked, and there's possibly no greater amalgam amendment than the First Amendment. The First Amendment is most frequently referenced regarding freedom of speech, but as you see from the screen, there's a lot more to the entirety of the amendment. Before the amendment gets to freedom of speech in the press, it deals with prohibitions against the establishment of a state religion or the favoring of one religion over other religions. It also protects freedom of public assembly and the right to petition the government. This assemblage of rights is much more in the wheelhouse of the ancient Athenian concept of isagoria, the equal right to participate in public debates, than parrhesia, the right of an individual to say whatever they want, consequences be damned. And only now do we kind of get to the mess surrounding the First Amendment, because throughout the history of America, it's been infringed upon for lengthy periods. There are numerous examples of how various levels of government favored Christianity as a de facto official religion. Sunday shopping laws, prohibition on gay marriage, and statutory holidays that mostly align with Christian religious festivals. All these things, in practice, have made America a Christian country. This would likely have horrified Thomas Jefferson, who said, "The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts as are only injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods, or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." Laws that uniquely benefited Christian values have crept into the American legal fabric since the 19th century, based on the popular myth that America was founded on Christian principles. In no universe were the ancient Greeks even remotely Christian. While the monarchies the Founding Fathers fled, those were propped up by the divine right of kings. So this idea of the First Amendment being limitless and inviolate, it isn't based on historical fact. Protests need permits. American broadcast media is heavily censored, though those limits are gradually being eroded. So where did this idea that freedom of speech is more like parrhesia, the ability to say anything you want, than isagoria, the right to speak in public to the government, come from? Why do Americans, uniquely in the world, collectively believe in the absolute right to say absolutely anything you want? And is speech in America truly freer than in other parts of the world? It may surprise you to hear that Americans aren't that much farther ahead of many other countries in terms of support for freedom of speech. The World Economic Forum created an 8-point scale to measure support for freedom of expression, and no country scored a 6 or higher. 6 countries scored above a 5. And which companies those are may surprise you. As of 2016, the United States, Poland, Spain, Mexico, Venezuela, and Canada all had fairly comparable support for free speech. Latin American citizens support a free press slightly more than Americans do. And while it's fair to claim that Mexican and Canadian opinions might be influenced by proximity to the United States, Poland's opinions are likely more connected to their experiences with repressed speech under control of the Soviet Union. Indeed, Russia and Ukraine show far poorer opinions of freedom of expression. So why, if America's Constitution is an extension of American values, does the country with the most radically free speech laws in the world have a citizenry that's relatively meh on the concept? There are a few possible reasons. One is that the median determined by these studies indicates a polarized America as opposed to an overall erosion of support of free speech. That is, a radicalized minority is pulling down the overall statistics, but a more granular examination of opinions might offer other theories. The First Amendment Center of the Freedom Forum Institute has been surveying public opinions regarding free speech since 1997. Let me repeat that since I bungled it. The First Amendment Center of the Freedom Forum Institute is the body that does these surveys. This Forum Institute has observed that the biggest free speech concerns Americans now have are fake news, followed by hate speech on social media. However, those surveyed believed that the responsibility was on the companies, not the government, to police that speech. And that's consistent with the letter of First Amendment principles. But is the increasing reliance on corporations to determine what we are free and not free to say, is this in keeping with the spirit of free speech principles, or are we becoming increasingly at the mercy of censorious corporate oligarchies? Put simply, should Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos have more power over the freedom of speech of the masses than the government? Opinion appears to be divided, and that's somewhat concerning. A communication company allowing cruel or hateful speech on its platform is not the same as condoning or supporting that speech, as long as they're not benefiting from that through ad revenues. Unfortunately, a lot of these social media companies got caught directly benefiting from hate speech and propaganda through paid ads. Consistently, only a third of Americans believe that the First Amendment goes too far in its protections. But the same survey has also found a persistent inability among most Americans to name more than 2 of the 5 freedoms protected by the First Amendment: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. 9% of those surveyed even believe the First Amendment protected the right to bear arms. Oy. The survey also found that while an increasing number of Americans object to biased news in theory, a majority of Americans prefer news that agrees with their personal biases. Americans are almost evenly split on issues related to speech on college campuses, however. Though a consensus emerges regarding speech on college campuses when a speaker is likely to incite violence or threaten public safety. Under these circumstances, a solid 70% of Americans believe that a college has the right to rescind an invitation to a speaker if they're likely to incite violence or threaten public safety. But the data gets even more granular as we change the question. Women and Black people were far more likely than white men to believe that a university should rescind an invitation to a speaker who would provoke mass protests. And Southerners were more likely than the rest of the country to believe that a speaker should be disinvited simply because they may offend. Now, this is interesting because the conservative-driven radical free speech base is at odds with the opinions of regular people living in Southern Republican states. Fortunately, support for freedom of the press is increasing after the election of Donald Trump. But opinions of important issues like this shouldn't rise and fall regarding the popularity of a person in office. Thing is, since most Americans don't actually know what the Constitution says, it's become extremely easy to manipulate opinions, leading to this nonsensical patchwork of opinions based much more on emotion than facts and reason. It's James Madison's prediction come true. Even the Supreme Court can't agree on the meaning of various elements of the Constitution, leading to numerous 5-4 decisions along ideological lines. People's rights and freedoms are hinging increasingly on popular tastes as opposed to inalienable rights, and that's real grounds for concern. The Supreme Court shouldn't be forced to decide this stuff in the first place. The U.S. system was designed to be based on compromise and minority rights, not the majority political makeup of the Supreme Court at any given time. The reason the Founding Fathers decided on representative democracy with an electoral college was to prevent the mob rule that overwhelmed Athens' direct form of democracy. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton believed that politicians in Athens had too much power to emotionally manipulate citizens. Based on contemporary writings, the U.S. government was deliberately designed to move slowly to allow emotions to cool and reason to reassert itself. Mobs, they believed, formed when public opinion was created and spread quickly. These opinion mobs, swept up by emotion, became generally uninterested in the rights of others. Madison and Hamilton accurately predicted the impact of social media. Emotions there matter more than facts. Quick action is preferred to getting it right. Mobs, powered by outrage and pain, rule online. Unfortunately, the outrage mobs have hijacked the free speech debate, turning it into a caricature of First Amendment principles. The rights of minority opinions are not being protected. People are being punished for being unpopular, not for being provably wrong. Online banishments that pick people's pockets by denying them work are the result. In some cases, speakers are, in fact, inciting violence and causing harm. Remember that Jefferson's benchmark was not just physical, but financial harm. In most cases, however, the outrage mobs online just don't like what a person is saying. At the same time, these globalized forms of communication are undermining the U.S. system of state powers by nationalizing or internationalizing every debate. Social media is also complicating the distinction between an individual's speech and an organized press. This is important because a story presented as journalism carries more factual weight than an individual's dubiously formed opinion, which might be why it's a separate element of the First Amendment. Accurate facts provided by ethical journalism and unbiased research are essential to inform reasoned debate. I don't remember the last time there was a large-scale reasoned political debate about something truly important. Everything has become emotional. This is often linked to too much freedom of expression in popular views, the rise of hate speech, and a lack of safe spaces. But a rational examination of the issue shows none of this is true. Hate speech is inherently emotional, as the name suggests. It is speech wherein the speaker has started with a predetermined belief and created a cherry-picked, often anecdotal narrative to support the inherently irrational hatreds. Fake news enables these hatreds by providing seeming evidence, which in truth is complete garbage. Which brings us back to a question I don't believe is being asked enough. Is the issue the First Amendment itself? Or is the problem the various incomplete interpretations of the First Amendment? The genius of the First Amendment is the elements it combines through carefully chosen wording. Borrowing from coding terminology, the First Amendment is loaded with the logical operator or with the operator and at the end. The punctuation is also interesting, combining the 5 freedoms into a single thought by use of semicolons and commas. It's a cleverly written single sentence, grouping belief, expression, access to information, peaceful assembly, and access to the halls of power into a single powerful idea. That idea is, essentially, that the U.S. government cannot create laws that restrict informed thought. Knowledge and power are inexorably linked. In short, the Founding Fathers believe that government should, never again, be able to tell people what to think. This is how it breaks down. Religions restrict thought through the idea of blasphemy. Restrictions on speech restrict thoughts in obvious ways. It's very hard to have a thought if there's no word for that thought. Restrictions on the press prevent regular people from accessing information so they can have informed thoughts. Assembly and petition give power to thoughts. They make them real. When people can't protest, that's a clear mark of suppression of ideas. No one should be afraid of peaceful protest, no matter how annoying or loud it can sometimes be. This central uniting premise on free thought should inform free speech opinions. The whole idea of appeals to reason is that reason minimizes the number of laws that are required, and the US government was founded on the idea, among others, that the fewer number of laws, the better. The First Amendment was never intended to protect comments made in public from any criticism, nor was it intended to protect people from each other regarding speech. The First Amendment does not prohibit companies or individuals from limiting the expression they're personally willing to participate in. The First Amendment, like the rest of the constitutional framework, was based on a series of checks and balances and was, therefore, never intended to provide unlimited protections for people to say anything and do anything that they want. Mass media has always been subject to censorship because mass media in America is not state-run. So what exactly is the First Amendment? What exactly does it protect? Well, that kind of keeps changing, doesn't it? The initial idea that the government would not abridge freedom of speech has become extremely complicated because consensus, the very thing that the U.S. system of government is based on, is becoming increasingly difficult to achieve. The overwhelming emotion that comes with angry mobs that the Founding Fathers warned about is overwhelming everything, because most of our dialogues are held on platforms owned and controlled by corporations, not the state. The challenge here is that corporate-owned platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook are sidestepping and overwhelming state powers. And these major companies all have well-paid lobbyists to make sure that doesn't change. Lobbyists, by the way, are protected under the First Amendment's right to petition the government. Of course, there are plenty of rules surrounding lobbying, with extensive disclosure requirements being one of them. This is another example of a constitutional right not automatically conveying absolute freedom. So it's interesting how one aspect of the First Amendment, speech, has been somewhat fetishized, while the remaining 4 still experience restrictions in spite of their status as constitutional rights. The big First Amendment question of our time, therefore, is twofold. Is unfettered speech truly free? And has the infiltration of moneyed interests and the idea that corporations are people eroded the ideas behind the First Amendment out from underneath it? There is no way a law can legislate decency or kindness. That's a given. The trade-off for freedom is tolerance for things we find unpleasant, scary, or sometimes even morally wrong. And just because something is legal doesn't infringe on an individual's right to avoid speech they find unpleasant all the time. There's a flip side to every aspect of the First Amendment. Freedom of religion also means freedom from religion. Freedom of speech also means freedom from speech. Freedom of the press also comes with a right to privacy. Freedom of assembly doesn't apply to private property, and the right to petition stands alongside the right of individuals to live free of government interference. Somewhere along the line, we lost the sense of the checks and balances that are the lifeblood of the Constitution. The Founding Fathers deliberately left out of the Athenian model moneyed interest having unrestricted influence on voting and government. That actually happened. The Athenians could pay people to vote. They could pay for anything that brought people to the polls. So rulings like Citizens of United fly in the face of the Founding Fathers' intent behind the First Amendment. Outrage activists, either online or in the real world, are also undermining the spirit of free expression by creating artificial barriers to a person speaking their mind. Another dynamic the step away from Athenian direct democracy was intended to disarm. The Founding Fathers left these elements out precisely because they upset the balance of democratic systems. Those who are frustrated by the slow pace of U.S. legislation either don't realize that it was designed to work slowly, or they don't care. Or worse, they want to override the very reason the system was designed that way, to allow reason to return after an emotional cooling off period. Everything in the U.S. government, from confirmations to elections to legislation, was designed to be an arduously slow process to stop Congress from acting like the Catholic or Anglican Church and to stop the president from acting like a king. Reason is the absolute best way through which to make laws. Reason also means we are not threatened by ideas. The oft quoted, "I think, therefore I am," Descartesian idea was actually, "I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am." I started this series with a statement of doubt that caused some people to go full outrage. I suggested that the First Amendment cannot be treated like a religious dogma, and so it may not be the best free speech benchmark in the world. The only way to know for certain is to test it. Nothing to really get upset about, right? The First Amendment should easily pass whatever test you throw at it, of course. Maybe not so fast. It turns out the focusing on the First Amendment in isolation is the wrong approach. Instead, we have to examine how the sum total of the rights and freedoms of Americans experience stack up against other countries. Based on freedom of speech alone, America definitely leads the pack. We saw that earlier. Though when we widen our examination to overall freedoms, America isn't even in the top 50 countries, according to Freedom House, which takes an annual measure of freedom based on civil liberties and political rights. You'll see this first page of 50. America is not there. America ranks 58th on this chart. America got deducted points last year due to the ultra-rich having too much influence over politics, general corruption, voter suppression of marginalized peoples, mass incarceration of people of color, and the infringement of the right to assembly in Ferguson, Missouri. And if you're looking at this chart, the overall freest countries in the world may surprise you. The top 5, if it's too small to read, are Finland, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Canada. Canada is the only country on this list not associated with yodeling. Now, let's take another step back here. The Nordic countries are relatively homogenous societies in terms of race, religion, and other immutable characteristics. So there's easier problems to solve in that regard in terms of inclusivity. In fact, Canada's lone lost point on the Freedom House list involves issues related to Canada's Indigenous peoples. But that still doesn't explain America's 58th place ranking in terms of overall freedoms. 58! I'll go to the next page to show you. There it is. America behind Belize and Croatia and just in front of Greece, Mongolia, and Poland, another free speech bastion. This lags behind most of Europe and most of the West Indies. To put that in perspective, Puerto Rico might be better off as its own country as opposed to an American territory based on local geographic trends. So, what the heck is going on here? Well, what's going on here is that the First Amendment was never intended to work alone. It's, well, an amendment to the primary wording of the Constitution. And that Constitution outlined a government of 3 separate co-equal branches. The U.S. government is currently operating as two parties instead of three separate branches, and since the government is essentially not following the Constitution, none of the amendments are currently working the way it should. This isn't just because of Donald Trump. No, really, it isn't. The system has been eroding for years, starting with the politicized articles of impeachment against Bill Clinton, accelerating with the Supreme Court deciding that George W. Bush would become president instead of Al Gore or George Bush being chosen by the Electoral College. Under Bush 43 and Barack Obama, the erosion continued through the excessive use of executive orders, and it's reached maximum velocity with the dubious circumstances of the election of Donald Trump and the ensuing rampant corruption. Trump gets a lot of blame for the dysfunction of the U.S. system, but not only should the executive branch not be able to do that alone, the dysfunction predates Trump by over 2 decades. And that's the truth about the First Amendment of the Constitution. It's an amendment, and unless the constitutional framework of the United States is functioning properly, none of the amendments can function as protections of the individual against government overreach and checks against consolidation of power in the executive branch. The First Amendment was never about freedom of speech, religion, the press, assembly, and petition for their own sake. The point of these amendments was to collectively provide maximum protections against tyranny and ensure maximum freedoms for the individual. At some point along the way, average Americans stopped understanding how their government works and the thinking behind the way the Constitution is written. I strongly encourage you to read the Constitution for yourself. It's a masterfully written, brilliantly constructed text, equal parts style and substance, text and context. It is truly one of the great documents of history. As the first text of its kind, it has symbolic importance far beyond America's borders. As America has retreated from the greater world stage, democratic norms around the world have also declined. Some younger people who have never experienced a military draft, war rationing, or profound loss of civil rights and liberties don't appreciate democracy for what it is. Here in Canada, you will not meet a person more appreciative of peace and liberty than an immigrant who has come from a place ruled by an authoritarian. And I suspect new Americans are the same. While many Americans fear and resent political and economic migrants, people who come to America seeking a better life truly appreciate what the American system offers. After all, the men who wrote America's foundational documents were themselves fleeing tyranny and persecution in the hopes of a better life. If they'd lost the Revolutionary War, history would have considered them criminals instead of trailblazers. Much of the wording of the Constitution reflects this. The First Amendment makes freedom of speech sound so simple. Congress shall just make no law abridging it. So why did it become so complicated and messy? Well, because people are trying to filter freedom of speech through a lens of heightened emotions, not reason. That's exactly the opposite of what the men who drafted the concept intended. Speech is not free in a mob. It is not free when the rich have more right to speak than the poor. And it certainly isn't free when controlled by corporate interests, which often operate very much like monarchies propped up by the divine right of shareholders. So what do? Well, what the founders intended. Freedom does not come without cost. Each individual must choose to either embody the concepts of free expression or reject them. This means sometimes you have to put up with hearing something you don't like or something that upsets you. But you should also be using your freedoms to stand up for what you believe in. Because a country born in rebellion, in revolution, teaches that freedoms are taken, not given. If you don't use your freedoms, you forsake them. So use your voice, your artistic gifts, and whatever platforms you have available to advocate for the things you believe in, not just to silence others or be a jerk. Eventually, the system of checks and balances will reassert because enough people will get sick of the tyranny of noise that we're currently living under. Much like after the invention of the printing press that I dealt with in a past video, we're getting used to learning a lot more about each other. Information comes quicker and in much greater quantities. We've got serious problems to solve, but we'll only get the best ideas if everyone is given the opportunity to present their ideas and not be shouted down simply because they're in the minority. Technology is making that easier than ever, as long as we work with it. Throughout my career, I've suffered the consequences of supporting freedom of expression. I've been slut-shamed, ostracized, blacklisted, and dismissed. But here I am. Sick as a dog, but here I am. You're listening to me right now. And that's only possible because the majority in the gaming industry and the radio industry and the television industry and every other industry can push me down, but they cannot shut me up. I believe in my ideas and I believe in the freedoms that I support. I don't have to be afraid of other people's ideas or denounce them or shut them out, even if I find them narrow-minded and short-sighted and sometimes kind of scary. The authoritarians in the gaming industry have picked my pocket and tried to break me. The free speech protections and open platforms pioneered by the First Amendment have allowed me to get back up again, free from editorial interference and gross fear of new ideas. Well, except for YouTube's odd fear of the female body. That's just weird. And there we go. Finally done. Like this, like videos like this, want to see more? Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Your dollars are what allow me to do these things and not just have to do drama-ridden hot take videos. Substance. You support substance. All right. I am going to fall down now because I have a splitting headache. But thank you so much for watching.